Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1 of On Duties, Cicero is going to explore the virtue of justice in a very important way. Now, On Duties is Cicero's presentation of Stoic ethics, in particular, ethics in terms of the four cardinal virtues. And quite often when people are approaching these four cardinal virtues, that is wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, they think that something has been left out. And the Stoics actually have some very important clarifications of that. And this indeed is one of those very important clarifications, because Cicero is going to tell us that justice doesn't just include what we might call strict justice. It also includes what we can translate as beneficence, or as you might say, a different kind of goodness that falls under justice. Beneficence is not a word that we typically use. It's actually just a transliteration of the Latin beneficientia, which means doing good to other people. So we might call it, in another old-fashioned word, charity. Cicero actually does use the word caritas at certain points. He more often uses these other terms, which we'll discuss shortly. But the general idea is that justice as a virtue is something wider, something more encompassing than merely following the rules or fulfilling, what is due, following the roles and expectations that you have. It includes the things that we would term, going beyond, giving, engaging in charity work or volunteer work. All of those can fall under beneficence. So let's start where Cicero actually begins this. He talks about justice as a virtue, that is, as a good character trait, something that we want to emulate, something that we want to see in ourselves and others. And like each of the virtues, justice has its very basis in human nature. It's something that we, as the kind of animals that we are, that is rational animals, are, you might say, designed or intended in some way to have as part of the way in which we comport ourselves. So it depends on some inclinations that are implanted within the very core of human nature. Very often not realized, sometimes only realized partly. All of that is quite true, but all of these inclinations are there. And Cicero says that one of the major inclinations that we have is what we could call a social instinct. We want to gather together within functioning groups and societies. And we need justice in order to do that well. So at one point he talks about justice as maintaining human society, that's just, societas, and a community, or as the translation here has, common bonds of life, communitas vitae. That is a life that we live together, not as isolated individuals, but as individuals who are in relation to each other in an ongoing way of common life. Now, this is actually going to encompass something quite wide in the end. One of the things that he does talk about, the Stoics were cosmopolitans. This in theory encompasses the entire human race, but generally we think about things that are closer to us, the family, our friends, our local community, our nation, or our state. And he tells us, in consequence of this, that justice actually has two parts, or that this virtue has two parts. One of them, he says, is called justice. He says there are two divisions: justice, which is the crowning glory of the virtues, and on the basis of which men are called good men. And then he says close akin, or conjuncta. That is like conjoined to. It's actually one of the words that's used for talking about spouses. Conjoined with justice is beneficence, beneficientia. He says, which may also be titled kindness or generosity. So each of these is really part of justice writ large. There's justice in a strict sense, which includes a lot of different things. I'm not going to try to tell you all of it here, but here are some examples of what Cicero places under that rubric. So giving others what is due to them. Giving others what they deserve. Distributing offices or resources, or even punishments or detriments fairly. That's one notion of justice. He very much stresses not harming other people, not allowing others to come to harm when we can prevent it, as also being part of justice. And then a third really important thing is when we make commitments or promises or incur obligations, that we actually fulfill them. And that is justice in the strict sense. He also includes many other things under that same sort of rubric, for example, talking about how we ought to treat the enemy in wartime. The Stoics did believe in something like a just war theory. That would fall under strict justice. We need more than that. That's not enough to have the entire virtue that allows us to live together well in human society. This is a problem that gets discussed by many moral theorists. And, you could say something like this: well, so long as I don't transgress anybody else's rights and I keep my hands off of their stuff, what does it matter if I'm nice to them? What does it matter if I speak to them? What does it matter if I have, invite them to my backyard barbecues? What does it matter if I exchange things with them? What does it matter if I pitch in when they're having some trouble? That's all besides the point. I don't have to do that sort of thing. Cicero and the Stoics would say, well, if that's your attitude, you're not really just, because you're missing this other half of the virtue of justice. There's justice in the strict sense. That's very good. Don't skimp on it. But there's also beneficence. To be beneficent, well, let's look at some of the things that he says about it. He says we can also call this kindness. One of the words that he uses over and over again is benignitas, which means being, this is the word we get benign from, being good to others, giving them things, helping them out. Generosity, liberalitas, this is another key idea that in some ethics will be separated off as a separate virtue. Cicero is placing that under justice, under beneficence. He uses other terms, like he talks about friendship, amicitia. He talks about love for those within your family, amor. He talks about what we might call, giving, caritas, or affection. He also talks about benevolence, which is just a transliteration of benevolentia, which is very similar to beneficence. Benevolence stresses the attitude, the willing part. Beneficence stresses the actually doing something part. So you could be benevolent in a certain sense, but never actually beneficent if you weren't able to distribute any goods to other people. So this covers a wide range. This might have to do with how you give people money. It might include what you do with your time, what you do with your attention, whether you, in fact, treat people well, whether you have a kind word or a smile for somebody who's down. All of that can fall under beneficence. The other thing that's very important to stress about this is that Cicero does not think that we have, you might call, a sort of unlimited universal requirement of beneficence. He stresses that, in fact, we can't be beneficent towards everybody, except in a very limited way. We might, in fact, have to choose between, different people who we give our rare resources to, or who we spend our time with. And he thinks that there are some general or basic rules or principles that we can use to understand how we ought to apportion this. So beneficence and justice actually connect up with each other in another way, because justice informs beneficence. Beneficence goes beyond what strict justice requires, but it's also still going to be governed to some extent by strict justice, particularly giving others what is due to them. So these two together comprise the actual virtue of justice for Cicero, and we don't want to leave this part out. If we do leave this part out, then we're not really just in the sense that the Stoics talked about. So he devotes a lot of attention to discussing the ins and outs of beneficence. Another thing to keep in mind is that, this is much more likely to be part of what we could call our personal life. We should be just in this strict sense in our personal life, but this is where we have the realm of our relationships that play themselves out. So both of these are going to be about equally important in realizing this social inclination or instinct, whatever you want to call it, and perfecting it rationally, making it into a virtue.